StoryHinge, Episode 87, Johanna Nuding, Casually Baked.
And I drilled down and drilled down and drilled down, and I was like, what am I in one word? And storyteller is what came to the surface. Yeah, and so when I moved back to the States, I moved out to California, came out west. I live in Oakland now, and I've spent the better part of 5 years being a corporate storyteller and a lifestyle writer and a blogger and a podcaster.
Welcome to StoryHinge. At StoryHinge, we explore foundational ideas and beliefs. We believe everyone has a beautiful story to grow. Now here's your host, Jason Vidaurri.
Welcome all to StoryHinge. Today we have on Johanna Nuding. Johanna is the founder of Casually Baked, which is a responsible cannabis lifestyle brand. And we're going to hear a little bit about that and what that means. But Johanna's also a marketing veteran of 18 years, as well as in the core of it all, she's a storyteller. And so with that, Johanna Nuding, welcome to StoryHinge.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. We had some conversation back at Podcast Movement Conference a few months ago. That's already been a few months, hasn't it? And
yeah.
Looking forward to talking about story with you. My understanding, you said you've been a storyteller for some time. Why don't you take us back and hear a little bit about your storytelling history, if you will?
I will. I mean, I think the universe sat you in the chair next to me during one of the talks, the podcast movement. So my very first intentional storytelling experience was in the third grade. And my teacher wrangled 7 or 8 students and was like, hey, there's this competition that we do, and I'm going to read you a story, and you have to remember it and read it back or tell the story back to your classmates, and you'll be judged on your accuracy and on your delivery. And so I ended up like being one of the last kids to go. And so, the whole time I'm like trying to remember this story. And then I walk into the classroom where I'm going to present, and my knees just started shaking like crazy. And I was like, oh my God, everybody's looking at me. And then at the same time, I was like, everybody is looking at me. And so it was this weird kind of like, I was scared to death and exhilarated by the whole thing. And so, of course, I won the storytelling competition. Duh. And I went on to do prose and persuasive speaking and poetry and ready writing all throughout junior high and high school, and was in the state competition for UIL. It's the University Interscholastic League. It's the academic stuff that, competitions. And just knew before I even left high school to go into college that I wanted to be a journalist. I mean, I wanted to be the next Barbara Walters. Huh. I wanted to talk to people and find out their stories and tell stories. And so I just have known for a really long time who I was and what really felt good to me. And so went to college and was the journalism major, and wrote for my school paper. I was the sports anchor for my college newscast. And then out of college, went on into radio. I also was a college athlete. I played basketball. And so I went to work for CBS Sports Radio out of college. And, that was where I first got tried my hand at copywriting and that whole corporate storytelling thing, because I was on the sales side of stuff. And so you have these big sponsors, and it's like, how do we tell their story over the radio? So I had done all the personal kind of writing and storytelling. And so that was a really new thing for me. And, just spent most of my career being a sales and marketing and, writing copy and doing all these sorts of things. And in 2010, my New Year's resolution was to simplify my life. And I started giving away all of my things and I started, just slowly downsizing. And I moved out of my big house into a condo, and, my pets passed away. And all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I'm 36 and single, and, there's no time like the present to just figure out who I am and what I want to really be when I grow up, because I think I picked the wrong dream.
Okay.
I was marketing director for 6 brands, and I was doing a lot of corporate storytelling, and just felt like this life was being sucked out of me.
Okay.
And so I quit my job and I moved to Italy, and I challenged myself to figure out what my perfect job would be so that I could get paid to be myself. When I drilled down and drilled down and drilled down, and I was like, what am I in one word? And storyteller is what came to the surface.
Well, that's
and
wild.
Yeah. And so when I moved back to the States, I moved out to California, came out west. I live in Oakland now, and I've spent the better part of 5 years being a corporate storyteller and a lifestyle writer and a blogger and a podcaster. And, my sweet little niche of being myself was being a loud and proud cannabis consumer and preaching the gospel of cannabis for wellness, and showing people a new side of cannabis and trying to change the face of the cannabis culture through storytelling.
Wow. That's a lot there, Joe. A lot there. I want to go back into hearing about the story itself, and what that maybe the first question is for you, what is a story and what makes a good story?
So, being a journalist, you learn a formula. You learn how to tell a story, and you learn how to evoke an emotion and hook them quickly. And the thing that I think, a good storyteller and what makes them stand out from the rest is finding your voice and maintaining authenticity and consistency. So, for me, it is the biggest compliment that someone can give me is to read my writing and say, I felt like you were telling me that story yourself. Or when they listen to my podcast and they say, it felt like you were sitting in the seat next to me talking to me. And so that to me is what a good storyteller does. A good storyteller captures someone, and they're there with them, and it's me and you. We are the only two people in the room, and I am picking up what you're putting down. So I think that is, I think that's an art. And it takes, your 10,000 hours. You got to tell stories.
Also, I was going to ask, do you have any ideas on how do you get to that, learning your voice and getting to that authenticity? You said, obviously, the time putting in there.
Yeah, well, and that's an interesting thing, because I write for a lot of individuals and corporations. And so on a day-to-day basis, I'm having to be a shapeshifter. I'm like, I have to wear the hat of a scientist, and then I have to wear the hat of a matchmaker, and then I have to wear the hat of a cannabis lifestyle guide. And so a lot of it for me, and I will say cannabis does help me a lot, because it opens up my creativity. Okay. But it's really, I think, figuring out what the avatar is. So if you're writing for yourself, and you don't know what your own voice is, you need to spend some time meditating, I think. But when it comes to being someone else, if you are a corporate storyteller, it is truly like drilling down and figuring out who your avatar is. Like, decide, who is this one person that I'm going to tell a story to? So I'm not trying to please the masses. I'm trying to please that 35-year-old mom who has 2 toddlers, and she's an entrepreneur, and she's trying to do it all and read labels. And, so it's like really learning and deciding who you're talking to. Mm-hmm. And that will then help you develop your voice, because, when I talk to people about cannabis, it's a different story depending on if it is a 65-year-old retired man or a 33-year-old professional woman, how I talk to them about it and how I engage them. It's, I think the biggest part of storytelling is really knowing who you're talking to.
That's a good point. Why is it so important to focus down? Because that's been, as a podcaster, that's one of the main things. You need to talk to a specific audience member, not everybody, not all males out there, not all females, not all pot smokers out there. You need to talk to a specific person. Why is that so important?
Well, because, okay, think about advertising. And we are bombarded with messages all day long. And with technology, we have a computer in our pocket all the damn time. So, there are so many messages coming at us. But when that one message comes through and it speaks our language, then we stop and we turn up the radio, or we, expand the screen and read the rest of the article. So to me, it's important because you're trying to find your tribe, and we want to affect change in the world. We all have our thing. We're all precious snowflakes, and we are here to do our thing. And so, I tell people all the time, if you're interested in something and you think it is the weirdest thing in the world, I guarantee you there's a tribe of people out there that think the same thing you do and are into that same weird thing that you are. So I think that is why it's so important, because, it's important because you make that connection, but then it also feels so good to get that feedback of like, I felt like you were sitting next to me. I totally heard what you were saying to me. And so I think having that connection, it evokes an emotion, and it really does create a loyalty.
Yeah. No, I think you're right on there. And I hear that, and probably one of the arguments would be, well, wait, you're getting too narrow then. My audience is going to be too small. I want to be more broad and grab all these people when I try to focus that message. But what do you think about that concept where my tribe will be too small then?
Yeah, I think that there are so many amazing storytellers out in the world that if you choose that method and that, then you just are going to get lost in the shuffle.
I think you're right. Tell me about this corporate storytelling and what you do there. That's part of your work that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And what are you doing?
Well, so, I do this in 2 different industries right now, and I've done corporate storytelling, with professional sports and music and real estate and all these different industries. But currently right now, I work in in lifestyle storytelling for a matchmaking firm and also for cannabis clients. So because, I'm a 22-year cannabis consumer, and I have been telling stories forever, and I've been teaching people as long as I've been using cannabis how to do things. People ask me questions, I tell them. As a cannabis lifestyle guide, I help people onboard into cannabis for wellness. So I know how to speak the language of these newbies in the cannabis space. So a lot of these big companies, they are trying to sell a product. They're trying to get people to sign up for their platform or buy their book or whatever. And they need somebody who can massage their messaging to make it palatable to a newbie or somebody who's on the fence about cannabis. So I do less of talking inside of the cannabis bubble and more talking out. Okay. And so I will help people within this cannabis bubble figure out their messaging and then turn around and give a creative delivery to people who are unsure about how they feel about cannabis. And then in the matchmaking firm, I write articles about love and relationships and dating, and I quote matchmakers. So I will come up with an idea and I'll send it out to the team of matchmakers and say, this is the topic I want to discuss. What are some of your insights? Do you have some examples of client stories that you could share with me? And they'll email me back a few things, and then I massage that information and create a story and make them sound highly intelligent.
How do you know when you've done a good story? Can you feel that and know that? So yeah, that was well done.
Yes, I can. And I'm a perfectionist. I'm a high achiever. I want all of my stuff to be really good. And so I do spend a lot of time writing and reworking and tweaking. And for me, it's a balance of being beautiful and flowery and narrative in my speak, but being concise. Because, for SEO purposes and things like that, we need short sentences, but I want short, sexy sentences. So, it's one of those things where I will work at it until I almost give myself goosebumps. And then I'm like, all right, this one's done. Let's send it out.
Okay.
So I think a lot of finding, where it feels really good, it's in the editing. It's sitting down and being a disciplined copy editor. And there's a program, Grammarly is a great program for storytellers to use. And so, being able to write something, copy and paste it into that program. And then they're like, you've used this word 3 times, like pick a new word. And so, sometimes those sorts of things help too.
Okay. Well, I do want to jump into the cannabis story you have. And I guess the angle that we talked about before on this, and I thought would be interesting, is like, how do you talk about a potentially controversial story? How do you present that out there? What do you do when you maybe get negative feedback? How does that work out for you?
Yeah. So, I practice out in the wild. And, when I'm in coffee shops or if I'm standing in line at the bank or, at the grocery store, I talk to strangers. I mean, I have lived all over the world and traveled by myself. And so I'm very comfortable just striking up conversations. And so that's where I practice my storytelling. And what I typically do is I let people meet me and get to know me and talk about, I used to live in Healdsburg, California. It's a beautiful little town. I'm standing in a coffee shop and these 3 men with their motorcycle helmets and their chaps on, and they walk in and they're standing in line to get coffee, and they strike up a conversation with me. And whenever they asked what I did, we talked for 3 or 4 minutes. And so whenever it came to, well, what brings you here? Why do you live here? I'm like, I'm a cannabis lifestyle guide. And I immediately saw the older gentleman just kind of stiffen up. So part of what I think a good storyteller does is to read the room. And so I'm like, okay, this guy is not a cannabis guy. And so I told him, I said, I teach people about cannabis for wellness. And he was like, yeah, I'm not a cannabis person. Like, I had a bad experience in college. And I said, well, what if I told you that cannabis is reversing the effects of Alzheimer's and dementia, and that you can actually take it and not get high? Would you be open to learning about it then? And he was like, really? That's a thing? Yeah, that's real. And I'm like, yes, there is science to back that up. And so that's how I dive into the story and preach the gospel, is by disarming them, by being someone who doesn't look like a pot smoker. And, and I like that now. I like that you can't tell if someone is casually baked or not, and it is, I think it's a fun story to tell, because I get to, it's almost like whenever you get to that, like, twist of the story where people are like, you tell them something they weren't expecting. That's fun. And so that's kind of how I dive in, and I kind of wormholed. So I don't even know if I answered your question. No,
that's good. That's very good. You remind me, sharing that, I had a similar experience moving out here to Texas from Colorado, and I had, I'm not a cannabis user myself. I never have been. Not that I have anything against it necessarily, but I came out here and I remember a couple of my first conversations with some Texans here, and And it was very much that's a very evil thing you guys did in Colorado. We don't, it's bad. And I was like, oh, okay, well. And I wasn't crafty enough like you to read the room and to then change the story. But nevertheless, I guess I want to ask you this though about that. Why cannabis? Why do that story? Why make that part of your life's work?
Well, so I have used cannabis medicinally, although, well, let me back up. I don't want to say that. I've used cannabis responsibly for 22 years. Mm-hmm. I learned very early on that I was using cannabis differently than my friends. And of course, I wasn't looking it up. I didn't feel like a pot nerd or anything like that, but I knew it made me better at my job. I knew it helped with my anxiety, and I knew it helped with my neck and shoulders. I have, chronic inflammation, but I was closeted. I was, I smoked multiple times a day, and it was like I couldn't be myself out in the real world. Or I would get high before I went to work in my corporate high-rise office and be in meetings, and I'm like, I felt great, but I couldn't dare tell anyone that I was high. And so I just knew how much it was helping me. And so I did start doing more homework, and I started experimenting with making oils and different things. And I learned the value and the importance of the plant. But I still would go home for the holidays and hide in the bushes with, my sister and sister-in-law and, a few of us, and we would, be stressed out about family stuff and smoking a joint outside and hiding. And I just thought, this is crazy. I'm a grown woman. Why am I hiding who I am? And so, part of me being in Italy and just really diving into, how do I get paid to be myself? I'm journaling like a crazy person. I was blogging my whole trip, just really diving into my storytelling. And I just told myself, you know what, when I get back, I'm moving to California and I'm getting my medical card, and I'm just going to be me. Like, I am going to fiercely be myself. And so when I went home to visit my family after living in California for that first Christmas, and my family, everybody's loud, and I've got 4 sisters, and everybody has spouses and kids and the parents. And so I get really overwhelmed because I live alone and I don't have pets. I mean, my life is pretty tranquil. And so I just stood up at one time and I was like, you people make me need to smoke a bowl. I will be right back. And that was just kind of how I was like, I'm doing this. And I went outside, and, one of my sisters and her wife followed me out there, and we kind of giggled and smoked. But when we came back in the house, my stepmom was like, well, tell me about this. Like, what does it mean? Like, you're smoking a bowl. And so it just me saying that, and it opened up this dialogue with my parents, and it was great. And so for me, I was like, if I can be who I am with my family, I don't care if anybody else likes who I am. I love who I am. My family is cool with it. And so it really gave me the confidence to start a podcast and write for a cannabis lifestyle magazine and tell my story in public and just be this loud and proud cannabis consumer. And I feel like there's so much stigma, and it's all based in bullshit. And so I'm like, I have to tell good stories and be this face of cannabis to help my closed-minded friends and family in Texas and, people around the country to rethink what it means to use cannabis. And there's so many beautiful medicinal benefits of it. There's so many different ways to consume it, and there's inconspicuous ways you can get high, you can not get high, you can cure diseases, you can, stave off anxiety, or you can just have a great time at a concert. And so for me, I'm like, I feel like I have to be one of those people because I get it and I'm a good storyteller. And so I'm like, this is my job.
That's cool. That's cool. What do you think one of the big benefits out there that most people just have no idea about?
About cannabis?
Mm-hmm.
Gosh. There's two major cannabinoids, two big components of cannabis that most people hear now, THC and CBD. Mm-hmm. And THC is what makes people high, and CBD has a lot of beautiful benefits, including anti-inflammatory, neuroprotectant. And so for me, one of the biggest things that I don't think people know and that they really need to know is that our bodies, we have an endocannabinoid system. So this THC and CBD, these cannabinoids, they have a doppelganger in our bodies that do the exact same job. And so they fit together like a lock and key. They're matching puzzle pieces. And so as we age, our endocannabinoid system starts declining. And so we need the supplementation of the phytocannabinoids in cannabis to supplement these endocannabinoids that are starting to stop producing. Just like as we get older and hormones and all these things, we stop producing those. Well, cannabis helps. And, our endocannabinoid system, it controls our pain sensory, our mood, hunger, our autoimmune system. So it has some really big responsibilities. And so I tell everyone that I know, if your parents are alive, like everybody should have their parents using a CBD product. Everybody. I use cannabis as a multivitamin. I have my cannabinoids in the morning with my vitamins. I take my CBD, my THCA, my CBG, and it's part of a wellness regimen. And so I think that when people hear me say that, they're just like, you just blow my mind. I don't even get it. Mm-hmm. So, I think that would be the biggest thing for me is that, it's natural in our bodies, and as we get older, we need cannabis.
I can also hear when someone's saying, yeah, come on, Joe, you just want to get high. You want people to get high. What's the bad sides of the bad effects of cannabis, or the downsides?
So one of the things is that, there's 3 keys to having a positive experience with cannabis: mindfulness, microdosing, and having a willingness to experiment. And when people get in trouble with cannabis, it's because they don't understand dosing. And instead of microdosing, a microdose is between 2.5 milligrams and 10 milligrams, depending what kind of a newbie you are, what size your body is, or your metabolism. And what ends up happening to most people is they go to a party and somebody has brownies or a piece of chocolate, and they don't read a label. They're just, oh, let's have fun. And they're having a drink and they eat a brownie. And then an hour later, they're like, I'm not feeling anything. And they take more. And then all of a sudden, they're on a whole other planet.
Yeah. And then 2 days later, they're coming.
Yes. And they're coming in hot 2 days later. So, and you really have to peel these people off the wall. Half of them want to call 911 because they think they're going to die. But the thing is, there's never been a single death from cannabis. So the one thing that I caution all of my parent friends and clients is that, when kids are in their tweens and teens, I equate it to a DIY building project happening in their brains. So it's being wired and plumbed, all the connections in their brains. And so I am a huge proponent of educating children about cannabis and how it works in their bodies so that they will hopefully not consume until they're 19 or 20 years old. When all of those connections are fully formed. There's a gene, and that let me back up. So I recently started working with an epigenetics coach. And so they can, by swabbing our cheek and reading our DNA, you can find out how cannabis works in your body. And so, this is something, and it's an endocannabinoid panel that they do. And I did a podcast on it. My next podcast is going to be my follow-up appointment because I had that test done for myself. And, that's something that it cost a couple of $100. But for me, if I were a parent, I would immediately, when my kid's 11 years old, swabbing their cheek, getting their endocannabinoid panel done, because there is one specific gene that if someone has a specific allele, then they might be 5x or 8x more likely to develop some sort of a mental illness like schizophrenia. And so there have been cases where people have, gone to that point where, a 16 or 17-year-old kid who's just smoking a ton and they have this one particular gene, then they could change their life. And so, for me, I'm like, $200-$300, it's worth the peace of mind of knowing how cannabis is going to react in my child's body. And frankly, kids are so smart now, and they've had access. I mean, they've had phones since they were probably 8, 9, 10 years old now. And they are so much smarter than we were when we were that age. And I honestly believe if a parent got that done for their child and handed this report over to them, and they said, this is your personal roadmap to wellness. And cannabis, if you consume cannabis, you very well could develop schizophrenia. That to me, that would change things for me. Yeah. And I think, and all the kids that I know, I have 4 sisters, a lot of littles, and, they want to have that conversation. They want to be smart about what they're doing, but they just feel like they've been told all these stories, all these tall tales about, this just say no. And, because I said so, well, that didn't work for us when we were kids. So, we got to find a new story.
Hey, wait a minute. Let's not take it too personal here.
You know what I mean? I didn't
know exactly what you mean.
until after I played college sports, because again, I'm a high achiever and I wanted to be the best at what I was doing. But as my nephew told me, not everybody's like you, Aunt JoJo. So, so I'm like, you know what? Smart. You're exactly right. So my thing is arming kids with the information so that they know exactly, what their own personal wellness path is.
No, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate your openness, and your depth of knowledge is obviously there, and that you've done your homework on this. And
oh yeah.
So I appreciate that, because that's so much. And as I look around, that's such a big part of telling the story. You need to have the information to be able to tell the good story, tell the right story. I have to ask you if you could, if there's another, I guess, cannabis story that you have. You shared a couple good ones there with your family, and do you have another one that you could share with us that kind of illustrates some of your experience with it?
Well, I mean, I'll give you some options. I could tell you about me having a bad experience with cannabis, or I could tell you about me doing a cannabis class with a group of seniors. And I mean seniors, I mean blue hair seniors, not high school seniors.
Well, that one sounds fun. I want to hear about that.
So part of what I do as a cannabis lifestyle guide is I will go over to people's homes, almost like that Tupperware party style thing, but it's all about educating them about cannabis in whatever thing that they want to learn about. So there was a group of older women who I went to one of their homes, and they ranged from 60 to 83 or 84 years old. And it was so funny because dabbing is a thing. I don't know if you know what that is.
Yep, I've got kids.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, no. Dabbing as far as cannabis goes, not like dabbing, but
explain that to me.
So, so you can smoke cannabis flower, or if they press cannabis flower between these two heavy steel plates, and all the oils come out of it, it forms this sticky wax consistency, and it is just pure potent product. And so dabbing is, instead of grinding up flour, putting it in a pipe or a bong and smoking it, dabbing is taking a heated element and dipping that concentrate in it and then smoking that concentrate. So it's something that I tell newbies to never do. Don't dab. If you're not an expert cannabis consumer, just leave the dabbing to the professionals. And so I get over there, and these women, they want to know about dabbing. And so I was working with another cannabis educator, and she had brought over the dabbing rigs and the different things, all the accoutrement that we needed. And there was, everyone, I'm going around the room talking, but watching all of these women puffing off of a vape pen. It was a really surreal experience for me. And it got around to the 83-year-old woman, and she's just sitting there, and she's like, no, thank you. And so then they'd pass it around the other way. And then they were trying a new something. And of course we're microdosing so that they're all staying with it and learning the message. But when it got back to this woman again, she said no. And so I paused and I went over and I knelt down by her, and I was like, oh, so tell me why you're not. Are you just don't want to, or are you scared? And she said, I'm scared. And I said, okay, here's the thing. I'm sitting right here beside you, and I'm treating you like you are my grandmother, and I would not let my grandmother do anything that I think would hurt her. And so I showed her, and I did it real slowly what I was doing. And I told her, I was like, and I won't leave you until you feel good. Like, if something happens, I'm not leaving you. And she took a puff off of that vape pen, and she blew smoke out of her mouth, and she just looked at me and just smiled. And a little bit later, I went back and sat down, and she looked at me across the room and just smiled, nodded her head. And I was like, this is amazing. Because my grandmother, my Joycey Bear, she was like, no way, no how. Because I've talked to my entire family about cannabis, and my grandmother was just like, I never. And I told her, I said, well, Joycey Bear, if you rub it on your knees and your feet and your joints, it won't make you high, and it'll make you feel better. And I said, and CBD can keep you sharp. She loves to read, and I was, I want you to be able to keep reading your stories and feel good and remember things. And so she'll use a cannabis muscle rub on her joints, and of course her husband, he every time I come home, he's like, Johanna, did you bring me one of those marijuana cigarettes? But I really think, like the elderly community and, baby boomers, like we're about to be overrun by elderly people in this country. And I really want them to feel confident and comfortable experimenting with cannabis, because I think it will be a complete game changer when people can live in a nursing home and have access to cannabis. It would change the whole vibe of the place.
Yeah.
Like nursing homes, assisted living facilities. It'd be like, hey, it would be a way cooler place to live.
So in this work that you're doing, what is your big goal then that you want to do with cannabis?
Well, if I say it in one simple, big, bold statement, is I want to change the face of the cannabis culture. And I joke to my friends that I want to be Jopra. I want to be the Oprah of cannabis. Like, I want people to hear me talk about something and be like, I effing believe her. Like, Oprah says something and we're like, yeah, that is the gospel. That woman is heart of gold. She is authentic. She is on a mission of goodness, and she has no alternative agenda. she's like, how can I live my best life? How can I inspire others to live theirs? And so that is a big thing for me, is I do live an inspired life. I only work with clients that I want to work with. I only talk about things that bring me joy. I think that is such a huge benefit for the cannabis community, to have somebody that's that passionate, that really will speak out and is not afraid to say it like it is, or talk about those things that people, get nervous to talk about. And, that's why I'm starting this second podcast, Love Mary Jane. It'll launch in October, but it's all about relationships in the modern cannabis culture, and whether or not that's having those tough conversations with your kids or your family or your coworkers, or even people out in your community who think you're terrible because you came from Colorado where they, made the devil's lettuce legal.
Yeah.
It's, I think that for me, it's just like, I use cannabis to live an inspired life, and I hope I can inspire others to do the same.
Okay. Well, let's make sure that people can connect with you and find your podcast. Where's the best place to do that?
So I am on social, on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and my handle is @casuallybaked. And my website is casuallybaked.com. And so there is a link to the podcast on my website. And of course, if someone, they listen to podcasts, they have their own podcast player, you can find me on pretty much, I think, anywhere you listen to podcasts: Spotify, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Radio Public, all those fun things, iTunes.
Okay, well, invite everybody to check that out. Before we go here, Joe, I want to give you an opportunity to hit something that we may have missed. Maybe an advice for someone be curious about cannabis and not sure what they should do. Why don't we hit that area?
Okay. So I think that if someone is, I call it, you're on the fence, you want to dip your toe into the water, I think one of the most important things that you can do is just experiment with CBD. And you can, and actually listen to my podcast. If, I talk about all kinds of stuff, but everything from onboarding to how CBD works to, epigenetics, talking about how our genes function. And so I want people to feel empowered. And so, I tell people that I'm in the business of canna confidence, and that's how you're going to have a good experience. And so if you remember to start low and go slow, because, you can always take more, but you can't take less. So, knowing that little tip, and the other thing too is knowing what your intentions are. So it's just like when we're telling a story, it's like, what message am I trying to get across? What do I want to leave people with? It's the same thing with cannabis consumption. It's, how do I feel in my body right now? Where am I? Your set and setting, all of these things are important, just like in a story. Like we have to set the scene. Who are the characters involved? How do I feel? And then how do I want to feel? And so by getting really clear in your mind on all of those things, you're not going to have a bad experience, because you're going to be doing it from a place of conscious consumption with a direct goal in mind. And then by listening to Casually Baked, the podcast, or, going into a dispensary and talking to a bud tender, or I have an educational kit that I put together and sell on my website. So just empowering yourself with information, but then always coming from a place of intention and consciousness. And, I think a lot of people, they come home from work, they just immediately kick off their shoes, go to the refrigerator, crack open a beer, and it's a mindless habit that happens. And so I tell people what I do is I come home and instead of having a drink, I have a reefer recap. And so I microdose a little bit of cannabis and then I sit down and I just kind of go through my day. And a lot of times, if you've had a really, a shitty experience in a meeting, or your boss threw some extra work on you at the last minute and you got home an hour and a half later than you wanted to, and you're just fired up. You drinking a beer or something, you're just masking what's happened and you're not processing what's going on. You're not processing and moving your feelings. And that's like sweeping things under the rug. And then all of a sudden one day that shit's going to blow. And so for me, having cannabis as my way to unwind, and I process and I feel my feelings. And then that way, the rest of the evening is mine. And I get to do what I want. I don't think about all that stuff. I just let it all go. And I get to just, have that peaceful, easy feeling until I go to bed.
That's awesome. Well, Joe, you tell an inspiring story, but I have to ask you one more question here.
Okay.
I've got a unicorn looking at me the whole time we're talking here.
There's
a unicorn on the wall behind Joe, and it's been looking here. And my last guest talked to me about, to find good stories, look around your house, and every object has a story. So I'm going to ask you, what's your story behind your unicorn object behind you?
Well, so these are new additions to the Casually Baked studio. The unicorn is Blondie, and the dragon is Blaze. And I got casually baked, and a friend of mine called, and she was taking her adorable little son school shopping before school kicked back off. And I went up there because she said it's this great little store. And I walked in this little place called Wonder Child in the Santa Ynez Valley. And I fell in love with this store. And Blondie and Blaze, along with some other interesting characters, were hanging on the wall. And I just was mesmerized by them. Now, I was also born in 1976, the year of the dragon, and so I always identify with dragons. And my girlfriends, because I'm 42 and single, and they're always like, Johanna, you are a fucking unicorn. So I saw these and I'm like, okay, if I were to have two alter egos, here, I'll duck down, sitting on my shoulders. Well, I guess I can't do it. I'm like, I've got Blondie and Blaze. And so, yeah, I just thought they were so cute. I couldn't not have them. Well,
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, thank you so much for spending time with us here on StoryHinge and sharing multiple parts of your story. Like I said, I feel inspired, and I think it'll be a great help for a lot of people out there. So thank you.
Yes, thank you. And inspired is exactly the way we should end this thing.
All right. Thank you, Johanna, again for being with us. Thank you all out there for being here at StoryHinge. If you want to connect with Johanna, you can do so at casuallybaked.com. That's her website. And her handle on social media is Casually Baked. And those links will be in the show notes and on the website. A few short thoughts here before we close today. I guess one of them is finding your voice. And that's not always easy to do, is to find that authentic, consistent part of yourself. And I guess I feel like I've made some steps in the past few years on myself, and a lot of that is just a lot of self-examination, discussing, working through ideas, writing them out, and I think that's a continual process that we go through. But I think that's where the best stories come from. They come out of that place deep within ourselves. And I guess a few other ideas is to keep the audience in mind. I know sometimes I forget about that when I'm trying to convey a story, because you customize it according to the audience, and that may seem real obvious, but I think sometimes we forget that. And the other thing I like that was shared is that editing is part of good storytelling. Sometimes we think that it should just come out, but there's an editing process. We got to work it over. We got to rework it, change it, and over time we get better at storytelling. But there's an editing process in there. So I want to thank you again for joining us. Be sure to share the podcast, subscribe, leave a review on iTunes. On the website, I have an instruction on how to do that. If there's any questions, that's at storyhinge.com. For those that want to deep dive into historical figures that have impacted our world and really made a difference, there's another podcast I'm running with my brother called 73 Mentors. Check that out. We have spent around 15 hours talking about Plato and Plato's Republic. And now we're in the middle of Galileo. And I think we're coming to episode number 4 for Galileo's coming up. So spend some time with these historical figures who have changed our world and really created what we have today. So you guys have a great week, great couple weeks. We will see you and talk to you again. And ciao.